Atheists like myself observe the outcomes of God's supposed actions and judge him accordingly, which is why so many of us would say, no, I wouldn't worship God. If he does exist, he's clearly cruel.
Genetically Modified Skeptic is an atheist YouTuber whose tone and cautious thoughtfulness I can really appreciate. And I think he feels the same way about me, given that on the trailer video for this channel, he posted, "I'm glad to see that young Christians have the compassionate influence you provide in this video. Well done, man." Today, I'd like to respond to a couple of things he says about whether we can know the character of God and what it's like. So let's jump in.
Christians necessarily come at this from a different perspective, though. Sure, God allows suffering, they might say, but he somehow uses this for good, even if we can't observe or understand how.
The atheist seems to think that if God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evils that occur, these reasons must be evident to us. But there's absolutely no grounds for that assumption. On the contrary, given our limits in time and space, intelligence and insight, we shouldn't expect to see the reasons why God permits every evil. Take, for example, our being historically limited. Evils which might appear gratuitous within our limited frame of reference might be seen to be justly permitted within God's wider frame of reference.
I would say this reasoning is completely self-defeating, of course, because if we are ultimately unable to evaluate God's actions as good or bad, we're unable to determine that he's ultimately good.
All right, first, we don't have a problem answering why God would allow some evil. The challenge comes when there are specific evils for which we see no obvious and immediate good that could come out of them. When Christians point out the glaringly obvious fact that if there is a God, we might not always be able to tell what his purposes are in every little move that he makes, we're not being ad hoc, as Drew suspects we are in another video. We are simply expressing our lack of omniscience. We're saying this is the kind of thing that in principle we shouldn't expect to be able to answer. I mean, it's kind of like if someone was visiting your home and you were giving them a tour, and when you were on the second floor, they said, "Hey, do you have worms in your backyard?" And you'd say, probably, I don't know. And they look out the window and they say, "I don't see any worms in the backyard from here." And you say, "Well, I wouldn't expect you would be able to see them from here." And they say, "Aha, ad hoc. Pretty convenient for you, worm guy." And just as you wouldn't expect to be able to see from the second floor window or even the first floor window if there are worms in the backyard, if there are good reasons why God might allow some particular evil or other, we wouldn't expect that we could know all of those, especially in the butterfly effect that good might come 100, 200, 1,000 years from now. But in both cases, with the worms in your backyard or the goods that could come out of particular evils that God allows, we can say we have good reason to believe they're there. But why? When it comes to making assessments about God's actions, we have two boxes. Box 1 contains all the things that if there is a God, we think we have good reason to know about him. The goodness of creation, the pleasures of this world, our moral experiences, the value of beauty, orderliness, relationships, and the resurrected Jesus, who is the image of God and reveals that he is gracious, kind, good, loving, compassionate, and all of those things. And box 2 contains all the things that people don't think makes a lot of sense in light of box 1. In box 2, we have pain and suffering, and also commands from God that seem to confuse us, mostly in the Old Testament, things like military and political commands. How should we think about these two boxes? How should the atheist think about these two boxes? If we think we have strong reason to believe that box 1 does show us what God is like, then we know that there's more to the story when it comes to box 2 than our visceral reaction to it, as powerful as that may be. This is why the Stanford Encyclopedia references Alvin Plantinga and Bruce Reichenbach. Quoting from the article, Alvin Plantinga, for example, says that in order for the atheologian to show that the existence of God is improbable relative to one's total evidence, he would be obliged to consider all sorts of reasons natural theologians have invoked in favor of theistic belief. The traditional cosmological, teleological, and ontological arguments, for example. In a similar vein, Bruce Reichenbach remarks, with respect to the atheologian's inductive argument from evil, the theist might reasonably contend that the atheologian's exclusion of the theistic arguments or proofs for God's existence advanced by the natural theologian has skewed the results. In other words, until you deal with the contents of box 1, you might come to the wrong conclusion about the contents of box 2. You have to look at the evidence. And by the way, the article goes on to say that while some of the things that we would say are in box 1, some of the theistic arguments might show that there's a God, they would still fail to show that it's a morally good God. However, that's why box 1 should include the moral argument and Jesus himself. So to put Drew back on the defensive, I'll leave it to him to try and figure out how to empty out box 1. Good luck. Now, if the contents of box 1 stands and we still have box 2, what does the situation actually look like? Let's move on to a second analogy. Let's imagine a 4-year-old boy who is the son of the President of the United States. No, not necessarily the current one. This person is whatever person, real or imagined, that you would think is a compassionate, a good, a loving, a caring person, a person of integrity, a person of high moral character. Kind of person we need more of in the presidential race. Now, yes, he's good, but because he's the president, he will have to take actions that will result in some suffering. Some people will be imprisoned. Some people will die in military conflict. Now, the 4-year-old has a box filled with reasons to think that his dad is good. But then imagine someone from the political opposition has a moment with the boy and says, "You're mean, old dad. He's so mean. He's so evil. Did you know he locks people up in dark rooms? And because of him, some people have died?" So the boy's got box 1, which is filled with good reasons to think that his dad is a good man of high moral character, who cares about people, who loves people, and all those kind of things. But now he's discovered box 2, and in box 2 are some things that disturb and confuse him that don't seem to fit well with what's in box 1 about his dad. Now, whatever you want to say about military conflict and things like that, I think you can see the point that if the boy could only see from his father's perspective, he would see that there were justifying reasons for his father to take those choices while still being a man of character, and a man who is generally compassionate, loving, gracious, and all of those kind of things. In fact, some of those harsh things might ultimately result in the best outcome given the circumstances. Now, if your knee-jerk reaction to this as an atheist is to say, yeah, but we're talking about a human person, even a president, but God is omnipotent and omniscient, and he could orchestrate all of this so that those things don't ever happen. That would be to attack the analogy instead of the point of the analogy and completely miss the point. The point of the analogy is simply to show that when one does not have access to the larger perspective, it can and often does have the effect of disturbing and confusing people in all kinds of relationships. But they might and often do have justifying reason to maintain their trust in the relationship on the basis of other previous evidence. In other words, the boy may not know why his father did what he did, but he is still justified in believing his father is a good man on the basis of what he does know about him. What's in box 1, so long as what's in box 1 is sufficiently strong to think that.
So, when I'm asked the question, would you submit to God if evidence wasn't an issue? I think, well, if I don't just assume God is worthy of submission and use observation and reason to make that determination, then no. But if I assume that I can't use observation and reason to assess God's worthiness and that I have to assume God is worthy of worship, then yes. As you might imagine, I'm not thrilled to give that answer of yes, because I think the logic it takes to arrive at that answer is nonsensical. So even though a Christian might think better of my intellectual integrity if I give that answer, it's one I feel compromises that integrity.
This would only compromise your intellectual integrity if you think that box 2 is all we have because you think box 1 is basically empty. But that means you'd be able to tell us why box 1 is empty, which would mean you have good reason to think that all the theistic arguments fail. And you think you have good reason to think that all the resurrection cases fail. Because if box 1 still stands, then you have to deal with it before you can make a determination about the totality of evidence that's in box 1 and box 2. This means you're going to have to go right back to talking about box 1.
To add another complication to this, in a lot of Christians' theology, God sends you to eternal hell if you don't submit to him. Now, though my own reasoning leads me to believe that damning anyone to such an afterlife is contemptible and makes a God unworthy of submission, I would still submit to that God if I knew him to exist. I don't want to burn for all eternity, and if my defiance of God does nothing to positively affect the fate I or anyone else would experience, then there would be no point to it. But there again, that's not an answer I want to give.
Now here it looks like what Drew wants to do is to put hell, the doctrine of hell, into box 2. We have to talk about which understanding of hell is the right understanding of hell. Now he mentions universalism later in the video as a possibility, but what your understanding of hell is pretty darn important. But as I know that Drew knows, there are other understandings of the nature of hell. And rather than go through all of that information here, I just point you to my video where on stage at the Rethinking Hell conference, I lay out 3 options when discussing the nature of hell. Even if it does go into box 2, not sure it carries quite the weight that an atheist might think that it does.
I don't want to appear to endorse that perverted system of justice by effectively saying, yeah, if it was real, I would totally think everyone deserves to burn in hell, so I'd make sure to tell God I'm sorry for existing, even though he's the one who made me in the first place.
Sorry that I was born, even though you created me. The fact is that might be a very Augustinian understanding of original sin, that you're born already guilty of Adam's sin. But as I've said many, many times on this channel, I think you're guilty for your sins. I think that what you inherit from Adam is a nature and an environment that might be inclined towards sin, but you're not born guilty of somebody else's sin. So yeah, if you have to answer for sin, it will be sin that you answer for that you committed.
Of course, a potential solution to this whole dilemma is just to explain what I have here, or ask questions about what God existing or evidence not being an issue really entails in this hypothetical.
I think that's admirable, Drew. And while I'm skeptical that one video from a Christian like me is going to resolve all of these concerns for you, I'm listening to you and I'm hopeful that this explanation might clarify to you a way of thinking about these things that allows me to say what I said in the clip that you clipped out and put in this very video. God nor the rest of us are the least bit self-conscious because of an individual who says they wouldn't worship this incredible King of love who's offering this incredible opportunity of life.